on this discussion is Dr. Allen.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this important panel. And thanks to those of you who have taken time from your schedules to join us here today. My goals for today are to encourage you to commit to anti-racism and to share guidelines for how to do so at institutional and individual levels. As I focus on race and racism, I acknowledge that other aspects of identity and related isms overlap or intersect with race in significant ways. These include gender, ethnicity, social class, sexuality, age, nationality, and ability, to name some of them. I will begin by defining terms. To quote leading race scholar Professor Ibram X. Kendi, we should begin by developing clarity and direction that can come only from definitions. After that, I will share some recommendations for how to cultivate anti-racism at institutional and individual levels. I invite you to take a few deep breaths, to center yourself, to be fully present and receptive. Let's begin by looking at the concept of race. So race is a social and political construction with no inherent genetic or biological basis, used by social institutions to arbitrarily categorize and divide groups of individuals based on physical appearance, particularly skin color, ancestry, cultural history, and ethnic classification. I want you to note a few points in this definition. Race is a construct. It's made up. Race labels are based more on political, cultural, and social processes than physical differences. You may know that the Human Genome Project scientifically concluded that race has no genetic or biological basis. However, race as a concept has been and still is being used to justify domination, exploitation, and violence against racial and ethnic minoritized groups. The construct of race helps to promote a sense of superiority for the white race. So race as a social construction across history, persons in power created racial hierarchies, and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach is one example. He established the most influential of all racial classifications. He cited 5 races, declaring, quote, "I have allotted the first place to the Caucasian because this stock displays the most beautiful race of men." Although race is an artificial construction, it has very real consequences, the primary one of them being racism. So racism is based on systems and structures. And to look at our slide, racism equals race prejudice plus social and institutional power. Racism equals a system of advantage based on race. Racism equals a system of oppression based on race. Racism equals a white supremacy system. These views of racism stress that it is systematic, not individualistic. Racism is supported and maintained both implicitly and explicitly by social and institutional power. An abundance of data persistently reveals that racism yields racial inequities and disparities in every sector of private and public life, including health and health care, criminal justice, politics, income, employment, home ownership, and higher education. To continue our look at race and racism, I'm struggling with using this technology, which is unlike what I have used, but here we go. Can you assist with somehow my screen, the slide went down? Is that on my end?
Yes.
Okay, all right, I'll carry on. So to elaborate on racism, I'm going to refer to the work of Dr. Tamara Phyllis Jones, who asserted that racism saps the strength of the whole society. She cites three types of racism. Beginning with, I'm not liking this. I got to figure out how to get this slide back up. Bear with me. There we go. All right. So institutional and structural racism refers to the constellation of structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that taken together result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. And you think about this in terms of what are some examples of these in higher education: curriculum, hiring practices, admission standards, teaching approaches, communication norms, types of student services, graduation requirements, evaluation, retention and promotion processes, and so forth. These structures help to maintain a racial hierarchy with whiteness on the top. The next type of racism is personally mediated or interpersonal racism. And this refers to a system, once again, notice the system, mediated through people, which I define, and this is from Dr. Jones, as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. In higher education, personally mediated racism can occur in all the ways and places that individuals communicate with one another. These include systemic and predictable racial microaggressions, which you may know are everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or not, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages related to one's racial identity. People of color are subject to a constant stream of these small insults and slights that can take its toll. If you're not familiar with microaggressions, I encourage you to learn about them. So the next type of racism is internalized racism. And Jose, as I go forward, would you please assist me? Would you take over and I will tell you when to advance the slide, please?
Yes, I could do that.
Okay, thank you. So internalized racism refers to members of stigmatized races accept negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth. And if you would push the slide up a bit so we can see the full slide, I'd appreciate that, Jose. Thank you. So this type of racism is really something that I'm familiar with. And a vivid example for me is a song that my Black friends and I used to sing when we were kiddos. So when you're white, you're right. And when you're brown, stick around. But if you're Black, ooh, baby, get back, get back, get back. So the colorism implied in this song is really something that exists among other races. And it's exemplified in things such as bleaching cream or, as one example, as well as beauty standards that revere lighter skin tones. This reflects the persistence and prevalence of white supremacy. Dr. Jones exemplifies this with a saying among some Black people that, quote, the white man's ice is colder. This dictates decisions such as with which racial groups one will do business. If you haven't heard of this before, I strongly encourage you to learn more about it. This is just a chilling, pun intended, example of how internalized racism can work. All right, next slide, please. So next we look at anti-Black racism. This is another category of racism. So anti-Black racism is any attitude, behavior, practice, or policy that explicitly or implicitly reflects the belief that Black people are inferior to another racial group. Anti-Black racism is reflected in interpersonal, institutional, and systemic levels of racism and is a function of white supremacy. So this type of racism is perpetuated not only by white people, but non-Black people of color who believe that they are superior to Black people. I have been pleased to see many Latinx and Asian groups and individuals who have made strong, explicit commitments to the Black Lives Matter movement. Next slide, please. So racism is a social determinant of health. And what you see here is, let me again see if I can slide this down. So racism as a social determinant of health is something that we really need to consider. And this is, when you think about social determinants of health, which refer to the conditions in the environment that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risks. Key areas are economic stability, education, social and community context, health and healthcare, neighborhood and built environment. Racism affects every aspect of life from from inception to grave, associated with those determinants of health. Dr. David Satcher was a 16th Surgeon General in the United States from 1998 to 2002. And he stated then that compelling evidence that race and ethnicity correlate with persistent and often increasing health disparities among U.S. populations, and that demands national attention. He said that the future of America as a whole will be influenced substantially by our success in improving the health of those racial and ethnic minorities. Well, as we all have seen, the COVID-19 pandemic has illuminated those disparities. And one example of this is racial battle fatigue, the psychophysiological symptoms from high blood pressure to anxiety, frustration, shock, anger, and depression that people of color may experience living in and navigating historically white spaces. In higher education institutions, due to chronic racial, micro, and macro aggressions that people of color can experience, the environment feels extremely stressful, exhausting, and diminishing to their sense of self-efficacy, comfort, and all-around well-being. Many of us people of color are feeling particularly fatigued these days as we struggle to process our own emotions from the double punch of COVID and then racial violence against Black people, also being inundated with requests from others to help them understand their newfound awareness that racism is real. During the past month, I've often experienced random moments of fight or flight symptoms. Now that I've offered an overview of race, types of racism, and some of their consequences, let's look at how to disrupt or dismantle racism. Next slide, please. And the way to that is anti-racism. As Angela Davis asserts, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Therefore, we should focus on anti-racism, an active process of identifying and challenging racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes to redistribute power in an equitable manner. And because racism is deeply embedded, we must take systemic actions based on the inequities that racism has generated. To redistribute power, then, we must focus on equity. Next slide, please. Equity acknowledges and addresses the reality that some racial groups have more advantages than others due to racism. Equity efforts work to correct such differences between groups. Equality, or treating everyone the same, ignores historical and structural factors that generate inequities. Therefore, we must strive for racial equity. Next slide, please. Racial equity is the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted, in a statistical sense, how one fares. When we use the term, we are thinking about racial equity as one part of racial justice, and thus we also include work to address root causes of inequities, not just their manifestation. This includes the elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race or fail to eliminate them. Next slide, please. With these definitions in mind and frameworks, let's explore how to cultivate anti-racism in higher education and beyond. To make substantial progress, institutions will need to address the systemic nature. Have I said that it's systemic? If I haven't, let me say it one more time. It is systemic. It's not located in individuals. So to make substantial progress, you've got to address the systemic nature of race and types of racism. Institutions will need to develop and implement, wait for it, systemic, strategic, and sustainable approaches to transform policies, procedures, practices, and cultures. This is essential. Achieving this goal also, of course, necessitates individual actions, which is our focus for today. Let's look briefly at some recommendations for institutional level actions before we delve into what you can do individually. Next slide, please. So these are actually based on proven practices. Number one, make anti-racism a priority. Embed and infuse anti-racism throughout every level of an institution. Two, develop strategies to make anti-racism a key aspect of an institution's mission, vision, and values. And I know some of you out here are familiar with the notion of SMART strategy: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. Draw upon quantitative and qualitative data. For example, analyze the racial composition of various roles in the institution. Also disaggregate those by variables such as gender, age, and so forth to ascertain and correct patterns of discrimination. And trust me, you're going to find those patterns of discrimination. On the qualitative side, focus groups, et cetera, to understand from the persons themselves what their experiences are. Number 4 and 5, first and number 3, best practices. The good news is that a wealth of best and promising practices exist. Now, numbers 4 and 5 go together to provide resources and require accountability from everyone. It's important to equip everyone in the institution to help achieve anti-racist strategic goals. You need to provide resources such as funding, training, time, etc., while you also should hold everyone accountable by using formal assessment processes that affect pay, retention, promotions, etc. This is particularly, especially important for senior leadership to be fully engaged, visible, and vocal. Ensure that professional development programs are comprehensive and ongoing. Avoid one-and-done training. I'm getting calls and emails to provide training on anti-racism or implicit bias. That's a tactic that I strongly discourage. As you can see, making anti-racism a priority at the institutional level will require significant resources and time. I invite you to advocate for this type of transformation wherever you are. In the meantime, you can make a commitment to anti-racism as a personal goal. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, taking a personal responsibility. As Dr. Kendi notes, being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. I agree with him that there's no neutrality in the racism struggle. Either you believe the problems are rooted in groups of people, or you locate the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. So understand that unless you're working to eradicate racism, you are helping to perpetuate it, regardless of your racial identity. Number 2, become more mindful. Become more aware of your behaviors and attitudes as well as others. Treat anti-racism as a personal and professional priority. Be honest with yourself. Be vulnerable. Be open to understanding how you help to perpetuate racism. And by the way, I'm doing all this myself. I always have, and now I have really upped my own game in that regard. Be curious. Number 3, educate yourself. A wealth of related resources existed before now, and now many more have popped up. So do not, however, ask people of color to educate you unless it's a formal part of their job or if they have volunteered. Or work within your own sphere of influence. No matter who you are, no matter what your role is in an institution, you make a difference, because by default or by design, how you are behaving, how you're interacting with one another, once again, is either perpetuating or helping to eradicate racism. Finally, here's one small tactic that you can begin to work on right away: the platinum rule. Next slide, please. So you're probably familiar with the golden rule, which is to treat others as you would wish to be treated. And so the golden rule probably could be useful. I can't move this down. Okay. All right, well, trust me, I don't know what you can see on your screen, but it says there, treat others as they want to be treated. So you're probably familiar with the golden rule, as I said, which is to treat others as you want to be treated. And that's one option for being anti-racist, especially as related to cross-racial interactions. However, persons from different racial groups can have different experiences and attitudes based on racism that would better benefit from the platinum rule, which is to treat others as they wish to be treated. Here's an example. Did you know that it is deeply insulting to most Black men to call them boy? If you do know that, do you know why? Historically, white men routinely describe Black men as boys to suggest that they weren't on equal footing with them. This includes, for example, thousands of Black men who worked as porters on railroad trains. Inventor George Pullman's sleeping car was a luxurious railroad coach designed for overnight travel. These men served on those trains. Many of the passengers called these porters boy or George after George Pullman, regardless of these men's real names. So this comes from when slaves were referred to by their master's names. So calling them boy, they were saying they were George Pullman's boy or servant. This demeaning history is why videos and photos of the sanitation strike that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led in Memphis in 1968, you see that many of the Black male marchers are holding signs saying, I am a man. If a white person or a non-Black person hears that a Black man is insulted for being called a boy, the golden rule might dictate a response like, well, that wouldn't bother me, or that wouldn't be a big deal for me. Invoking the golden rule in that way would really be a type of microaggression, of denying or dismissing someone's feelings. The golden rule assumes that kind of equal experiences and attitudes that actually draws upon racist attitudes and can lead to a sense of being dismissed or disrespected. So the platinum rule, on the other hand, invites acknowledgement that other feelings and attitudes exist. It requires curiosity, a willingness to learn about others, a willingness to believe people when they say, ouch. So these are just a few ideas for how you can cultivate anti-racism as an individual while fighting for institutional level change. Next slide, please. As we continue the panel, I encourage you to think about how you will strive for anti-racism. Working to eradicate racism in our society in general and in higher education in particular is a crucial and challenging undertaking. We won't get it done overnight. It will take time and concerted commitment. Although your individual efforts alone will not achieve institutional transformation, they certainly can help. Next slide, please. And then the next slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. Next, we have Dr. Hotchkins.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. And so, the question that I ask, and I'll be asking a few, is do Black Lives Matter? And so as we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, I want to recognize Alicia Garcia, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who created the Black Lives Matter hashtag, which ultimately evolved into a movement. And so my grandmother, Maddie Mitchell Sango, would always tell me, before you ask people questions about what they think and who they are, tell them who you are before you tell them what you think, right? And so Bryan K. Hotchkins, pronouns, he, him, his, man of Cameroonian descent, born and raised in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, professor, founder of Think Positionality, alumnus of University of Utah, University of Oklahoma, Southern Methodist University, Marvel Comic University junkie, and husband of 24 years. And so I normally ask starter questions. And so I don't know if we can go back and forth with me asking. If we can, then I'll answer from questions that previous participants in my work have answered. The first question that I ask is, when did you realize being Black meant something different than being white? So I'll pause. If one person can answer, that'd be great. If not, I'll provide an answer that I've heard before.
Somebody said kindergarten.
Kindergarten. Okay. And so an example that was given in a previous session was there was a Latina who grew up and partially in her life in California. And so her parents moved to Mobile, Alabama, when she was around 7. And so her first day of school, they had a kickball game. And so they divided the groups into a black team and a white team. And she was selected to be the person that rolls the ball, right? So she's the pitcher. And so she went and doing that for 3 days. And she went home and told her parents about it. And her parents had to have a meeting with the principal about it, right? And that was the first time that she began to understand, and moving to the South, that there was a difference between being white and being black, and what was her space and place in being Latina, since she didn't occupy either of those spaces, right? And then the second question that I asked, I want someone to define the words American and black. And I'll wait. Can't see the responses.
American equals born in America. American is someone who lives in any part of North or South America. Black equals skin color. American equals nationality.
Okay.
American, a person who.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. The picture that I showed in the background was a picture.
Black cannot be defined.
Say it again.
Somebody said black cannot be defined.
Okay, thank you. What are the responses? The picture that was showing in the background was a picture of Minneapolis, in particular, an Arby's store, and fire of the response to George Floyd's murder. And so a lot of my white colleagues have called me and said, why now? Why now, and what can I do? Right? And so in having discussions with my elders in my community, I'm mindful that I believe this flashpoint is tantamount to the Emmett Till murder. And so Emmett Till was murdered on August 28th, 1955 in Mississippi. And this is a picture of him alive, juxtaposed to a picture of him dead, right? And so he was buried on September 6, 1955. His mother allowed Jet Magazine to take pictures of him, open casket, have a funeral open casket, so people could see how he was beaten, right? And so the folklore is that he whistled at a white woman, and because of that, he was murdered, right? And so the George Floyd incident is one where we were able to see his death transpire live on video. What was most telling for me was not necessarily saying that he can't breathe, right? So we've seen other Black people being accosted and experiencing police brutality, and those persons said that they couldn't breathe. In hearing and watching the video initially, I didn't know until his funeral that his mother was deceased. Right? So for me to hear him calling out for his mother, knowing that she was not able to come and save him, that was traumatizing for me to watch the video, but it just reminded me that his mortality, he was mindful that his life was slipping away. Right? And so as we have these conversations about the question around does Black Lives Matter, I want you to think about first what anti-Blackness is, right? And so for those of you that subscribe to New York Times or have a moment to read this article, call it what it is, anti-Blackness by Professor Ross, right? And these are 3 citations that stood out most. Anti-Blackness is more than just racism against Black people. It is a theoretical framework that illuminates society's ability to recognize our humanity, the disdain, disregard, and disgust of our existence. The second quote, the thingification of Black people is a fundamental component of their identity within this nation. And then this final quote, anti-Blackness describes the inability to recognize Black humanity, which always warrants gratuitous violence. And so in that piece, there's made mention of a theoretical framework. And so as I want to try to immerse you in the origins of the term anti-Blackness, right, and why it is allowed to play out in the present because it was created in the past, right? And so if you can take Dr. Wilderson, Google Afro-pessimism, right? And so within the construct of Afro-pessimism, a theoretical framework is offered, right? And the definition of Blackness is on which we build our understanding about anti-Blackness, right? And so the definition, Blackness is coterminous with slaveness and is incapable of being separated from slavery and marks the ontological position of Black folks, right? And so what does that mean? It means that Blackness is coupled across space, place, and time with what it means to be a slave, right? And so for Black persons, our ontological, our position of reality, right, is never separated from what it means to be a slave or enslaved, right? And that banner of slaveness is attached to Black people, right, even in the present, right? And so then a question that I would pose is a true or false question. Blackness is social death, never having a moment of social life. And if you think about whether that is true or false, I'll provide some more context, right? And so the African who was stolen from Africa and brought here to participate as chattel slavery was constructed as slave, which means that they weren't afforded life, right? They were a thing, as the previous quote mentioned. They were a thing, they were a commodity, they were property, right? And so in order to be those things, you don't have a soul, you don't have rights, right? You don't have anything that should be respected by the white people that brought persons of African descent, Africans at the time, to the United States, right? And so what has happened is Black people are constructed within that as dying, right? In a constant state of death and never having life. Because to acknowledge that the African has a life would be to acknowledge that the African was human. And to acknowledge that the African is human would be to have a debate and a discussion about their humanity, right? And so I've watched about 1,000 movies. And one of the movies that I've watched is Amistad, right? So Amistad is ultimately about the humanity of the African, right? This conversation around, are they property or are they human? Do they have life? Should they be allowed to be free? Can a person be free versus can a thing that is an inanimate object be free, right? And so that is the question. Blackness is social death, never having a moment of social life. And so Dr. Allen mentioned that race is socially constructed. And so to construct the African who was enslaved as Black and dead, which is to construct them as not having life, right? And so this is a quotation from the work of Dr. Wilderson. There was no time for the slave or place for the slave. The slave's reference to his or her quarters as home does not change the fact that it is a spatial extension of the master's dominion, right? And I'll read that again. I want it to sink in because it is heavy, right? There is no time for the slave or place for the slave. The slave's reference to his or her quarters as home does not change the fact that it is a spatial extension of the master's dominion. And so I said I watch a lot of movies. And so 12 Years a Slave is a perfect example of the master's dominion extending across and throughout the United States. Right? And so we know that the Civil War was about ending slavery. It was about the abolishment of slavery. Right? And so prior to watching that movie, I was unaware of the Louisiana chattel slave sugarcane industry, right? So I learned that slavery was framed around cotton. So I wasn't familiar with tobacco or sugarcane, right? And so I was unaware that there were persons who went all across the United States that were white men and captured Africans who were born free, right? For lack of a better term, were born free and brought them into slavery, right? And so that reminds me that even though slavery was framed as a function of the southern states, right? The states that wanted to secede from the Union, the states that wanted to create the Confederacy, right? There were no boundaries, right? So the white people in that space believed that the Confederacy knows no bounds, the Master's Dominion knows no bounds, so they had the right to go up north or anywhere in the United States to capture any person of African descent, because that person was not framed or seen as person. They were seen as thing, even if they were born outside of slavery as free, right? The fourth thing is the violence of slavery is not precipitated as a result of any transgression and has always been experienced by Blacks since arriving in America. And I want you to think about the weight of that, right? Since my ancestors arrived here in the hull of slave ships, Black people have never not known violence, right? And so as I was thinking today about the extension of the Master's Dominion, I thought about how Breonna Taylor came home, probably planned out her day, right? And when she went to sleep, you know, my parents taught me this prayer, you know, now lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. God bless mama, God bless daddy, God bless everyone. Like, that's the prayer that I would pray, right? If she prayed that prayer, she went to sleep thinking that she would wake. But she was shot 8 times and died in her sleep, probably never awaking. Police entered her home with a no-knock warrant, not dressed as police officers, right, and killed her. In the same way that Botham Jean in Dallas, Texas, right down the street, well, 5.5 hours, right, from Lubbock, a white female police officer believed that someone was in her apartment, right? So he was killed in his home, watching TV, probably thinking about how he was going to plan his day, right? And so as I used to think that my home was the safest place that I could reside in as a person of African descent. But now I realize and understand that I'm not even safe at home, right? That I could be killed in my house. Anyone in my house can be murdered, right? If the state so says that they have the authority to do so, right? And so just be mindful that for generations, people of African descent have never known a space, a place, and time where violence has not been a part of our lives. Now, also be mindful that the term Blackness is juxtaposed to what it means to be white, right? And so whiteness is the opposite of. So to be white during the time of slavery was to be able to be a landowner, was to be able to be free, was to be able to not be considered as property, was to be able to get an education. So we know that there were laws passed that if you taught an African how to read, you could be killed, or that person could be killed, and you could receive a fine, right? And so I'm mindful of the history of the controlling of Black bodies, right? And so in this picture, there's a badge, plantation police, right? And so people were deputized, runaway slave patrols, to capture people of African descent, whether they were or were not born outside of slavery. And right, so I want to transition, now that you know a brief of the history, I want to transition to what is it like to be an anti-racist, to engage in transformative change, right? And so I posed a question for you to contemplate. People of color are incapable of being racist. That's a question that I asked to get a true or false perspective of people around how racism unfurls in the United States, right? And so it relates to the definition. Definition of anti-racist, an abbreviated one, is an anti-racist is someone who supports an anti-racist policy through their actions of expression of an anti-racist idea, right? And so I'm mindful that the action of practicing anti-racism begins after one believes racism must be eradicated, right? So it's not enough to make the declaration. And so everyone would probably say racism is bad, right? And that's great that you would acknowledge that. But the goal is to move beyond that, right? So I often say that I'm an anti-sexist. And so maybe 7 years ago, I had an interaction with a Black woman colleague who called me sexist. And I said, well, wait, how can I be sexist? Like, my wife is Black, my daughter's Black, my mama's Black, my grandma's Black, my aunties are Black. I love Black women. I can't be sexist. But the more I said and thought about it, I was like, okay, well, I benefit from misogyny. I benefit from the patriarch. I benefit from sexism. All these systems are moving in my favor at all times, right? So I am sexist. But the only thing I can aspire to be is anti-sexist. So every day I have to try to work towards dismantling those systems, right? And have to be less sexist the next day than I was the day before, right? And so I want you to make sense of this. I think I figured out white people. They are starting to choose between righteousness and comeuppance. And so because of COVID-19, I have a weekly talk with my guys, right? And one of them made this remark to me, and it got me to thinking. In my adult life, this is the only time I've ever experienced white people delineating their whiteness, right? And so they say, hey, I know I saw this on TV. You might have seen this. I'm not that type of white. I'm this type of white, right? So they're making meaning of saying, I want to be on the right side of history. That's a new term that I've heard. I want to be on the right side of history. And so I'm not that type of white person, right? It's not, the response is no longer, well, I didn't own slaves, right? The response is now, my white's not like that, right? So when I pose the question, do Black Lives Matter? I ask that question to white people. Once you tell me your answer to that question, I know whether you're anti-racist or you're the person that has just stopped at saying racism is wrong, right? And so the last question that I usually ask for them to contemplate is, how will you measure the success of anti-racism actions moving forward? So I want to show a video brief right here.
I don't know what more we as a sports community need to see than a white police officer kneeling on George Floyd's neck and ripping his life from him. And having to see that for 8 minutes and 46 seconds was heart-wrenching.
If you don't feel like this is your opportunity to speak up, be active, use your platform, then you're missing it. You're missing the point. You're missing out on the opportunity to be on the right side of history.
While the murder of George Floyd was at the center of everyone's attention, too often we forget about Black women, like Breonna Taylor.
The 26-year-old Louisville first responder shot 8 times and killed by police.
Discrimination is something that I experienced not only as a woman, and not only as a Black woman, but also as a Black Muslim woman.
We have no intention of stopping this fight until we have eradicated every single remnant of racism in this country.
Men, we need to take care of our women.
We have to seek to liberate the most intersectionally oppressed, the ones that bear the burden of multiple layers of oppression.
The very real question we all have in this moment is, when will it end?
And so, although I don't believe that it will end in my lifetime, right? I'm mindful of wanting to have some actionable items that to give you to takeaways to be able to show that Black Lives Matter, right? And therefore, so first, continue to educate yourself about not only racism, but also understand the narratives of people who experience it by attempting to get to know their lived realities. 2, examine your social and trust circles to see how diverse they are as it pertains to race, gender, sexual orientation, and religious preferences, and know that it is okay to learn in your discomfort. Be ready, willing, and able to disrupt racism whenever you hear, see, or experience it by holding people accountable, especially those you love. Right? And so I'm mindful when doing the work that most people who accept and understand racism were told by their grandparents, by their spouses, right, by their parents. And then the last one is conduct a daily self-inventory. Dismantle your personal biases. Each day you of interrogating who you are and the numerous ways you silence and marginalize others. And so I used to collect newspaper clippings, but now you can just download them. This one really stood out to me. It's funny, but it's serious, right? So my white friends who have called me and colleagues, they're exhausted, right? Just they realize, hey, racism is bad, and they're exhausted by that. But I need them to know, like, you're exhausted by just now finding out. Like, I've been exhausted, right? But I'm in shape because it's what I do. And so I need a 100% required commitment from you to do this anti-racist work if you're going to do it. because there's a lot of work to be done. And so that concludes my presentation.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hotchkins. We will now be taking questions from the Q&A chat. I do have some that I have a question here from some of the students. They want to know that as students, how do they maintain attention of higher education institutions that have recently acknowledged the Black Lives Matter movement? How do they advocate for moving beyond vigils, email statements, and conversations towards sustained change action?
Well, can we go to split screen to show Dr. Hotchkins and me?
Yes.
Dr. Hotchkins, you want to take that question?
Yes, and so I think I'm looking forward to seeing how students activate once they come back to campus, right? And so I think that now is the moment for students. If you ever thought as a student your voice couldn't be heard, now is the time for your voice to be heard, right? And so, but it starts from the top and works its way down. So talk to your university president, talk to your provost, talk to your dean, right? Talk to your associate vice president for student affairs. Like, be mindful that Black students on your campus are going to be doing programming, are going to want to come together and discuss their thoughts about how they feel, right? And so I've been talking to Black students all summer, basically, right? And so there's a sense of not being safe, right? Like when people say Black Lives Matter, I expect you to actualize that after you say it. And one way to do that, the first way to do that is listen, right? And so before you come with ideas, listen, right? And then harness your outrage, because you're going to be outraged, right? And how do you apply that outrage, right? If you're white and you're a student, if you're in a space where only white people are, you need to be the most outraged. You need to be the loudest. You need to say, well, how do we diversify, right? We need more Black professors of African descent. How many Black deans do we have on our campus, right? Are Black people expected to do all the emotional labor of the moment? Because we don't want them to, right? So as a white person, you need to step up and say, white student, I want to help. This is how I'm going to help, but get advice, right, about how you can be most useful, and then move forward with that.
I totally agree with that. And to that, I would add, as I have also worked with student groups, is it sees this moment, act as if for those, so I worked with a group of Black alums from a major institution here in the United States. Someone they knew contacted me because they were getting ready to meet with this president of this prestigious university as Black alums. So I said, act as if this president is going to take you seriously and strive to request, again, my mantra, strategic, systemic, and sustainable efforts towards anti-racism. So that means it's back to what both of us have been talking about, policies, procedures, practices. So they had, for example, they wanted to have a space on campus where they could gather. They wanted to recruit and retain faculty of color. And I said, don't forget about staff. This needs to be all, at all levels of the institution. So I said, ask them about what are they as leaders doing to learn how to be anti-racist? How are they starting with themselves? So again, anything that's strategic, systemic, and sustainable, not something that potentially could be superficial. You want to aim for things that are going to put some roots down, because I'm concerned that this is going to pass. So you want to optimize, seize the day. So those are just a few examples. And you look at some of the models for there's a racial frameworks for institutions, anti-racist institutions. So I would say go to those kinds of resources for the requests and demands. And all of the advice that you just received is really crucial in terms of what you do on a personal level and within your sphere of influence.
Can you make it where I can send in the chat?
Sure.
Even I can talk, I can't.
As a white assistant professor, how can I better support my staff, students, and volunteers of color without making them feel singled out for the color of their skin?
I think it begins with what kind of work are you doing to be anti-racist? So if you haven't done any work like that, that you begin with self and you draw upon the wealth of resources that can help you do that, as well as working with your white counterparts along those lines. And in so doing, in that way, you're going to demonstrate that you support. I believe that's one of the key ways to assist. And in some ways, then it's not so much focusing on the persons of color as it is on yourself as a white person and other white people in your environment. That's one idea. Dr. Hotchkins?
So part of it is, how do you know what they need, right? And so if you have a rapport, I would start with the persons you have a rapport with, right? Because those persons can say that you've been vetted or that you want to have an understanding, right? And so the person that you have a relationship with, ask them what they need to see if you can utilize your white privilege to facilitate their attaining it, or if you can't, right, you can guide them to the persons that have whatever it is that they need, whether that's silent space, whether it is a space for venting, whether it is to be left alone and not bombarded with 1,000 questions about what you can do, right? So those are just some examples of what you can do.
Yeah, I appreciate how you're framing it, because it helps me come back to thinking about the difference between at the individual level and the institutional level. And so, being engaged at both of those levels, and for me especially, and I know from your presentation, especially focusing on ways you transform systems, because what they need is a place where inequities do not exist. And the more work you do to disrupt and dismantle those inequities, then that's going to make it better for them. Next question.
Okay, for Dr. Allen, has the definition of racism always been embedded in the understanding that it is systemic? Has it been conflated with prejudice in the past?
I cannot speak to the history of the definition of racism, and Dr. Hotchkins, perhaps you can. However, I do understand that if we are to address it, we have to take the systemic approach. And my understanding as well is when you think about race being constructed in the way that it was, for the purposes that it was, I think, I would, from my perspective, it has always been systemic. And in some ways, I think deflecting it to act as if it's located only within individuals is a means by which white supremacy can continue to reign. The belief systems can continue to persist.
As a student working under residents and attendings in the hospital, how would you recommend we confront microaggressions that we notice our superiors commit?
And so that question then becomes about your willingness to place yourself under fire, right? And so I believe as a Black professor, I'm under fire without even speaking, right? My Blackness, when I enter the room, I'm under fire, right? Because someone is questioning why I'm there, right? But if these interactions are microaggressive by your supervisors as they're interacting with persons attending the hospital, then you are likely mostly experiencing those too from the same supervisors, right? And so it is always, I believe, to call out racism is the number one thing that an anti-racist does, right? And so as a group of students, you may say, well, we find more support to move as a unit. So you may say, okay, listen, here's what we're going to do. For the next 30 days, we're going to, as residents, we're going to write down every single time, date, place, and moment we heard a supervisor commit a racial microaggression or say something racist. So after the 30 days, you go to them and say, we want to conduct a meeting with you, just because you are teaching us how to be doctors, right? And we want to make sure that this part of it isn't part of how to be a doctor. And each of you tell them what they've done for the last 30 days. Then it won't just be about opinion, right? It'll be about perspective based on how you documented what happened. And part of that is they'll never know how deeply the persons that they said it to were hurt. They'll just know your pain or how it bothered you. I think that's a good step, documentation and presentation.
I think that's an excellent idea, to which the only thing I would add is to draw upon the literature and what's published about what microaggressions are. They're real, they have implications. There's research about it in the medical profession. So you combine your personal experiences with backing it up with research because unfortunately sometimes that matters a lot in institutions of higher education, that you have data or proof. And I think combined in terms of you being able to describe, you said and did this, that, and the other, because more likely than not, what you observe is going to be in the wealth of publications that say, here are examples of racial microaggressions. And that then is going to be hard for that person to say, I didn't do it, right? So I think, yeah, that's great advice.
And I have one final question. What are your thoughts about positionality statements that were released after the George Floyd murder? You feel that the burden should be on Black folks to help write these statements?
You're breaking up. I couldn't quite hear the question.
Oh, I apologize.
That's okay.
What are your thoughts about positionality statements that were released after the George Floyd murder? Do you feel that burden should be on Black folks to help write these statements?
Oh, you mean like institutions where people are saying, where folks are kind of saying, here's where we are and here's blah, blah, blah? Published statements by institutions?
Yes.
Well, I have a lot of experience with that, having been a chief diversity officer, and the challenge of working with upper level leadership, A, of whether or not to issue statements, B, of what's the purpose of those statements, and C, what to say within them. That is rife with a lot of complexities that include forces above them as leaders, like regents and governors and presidents and so forth, that discipline them in terms of what to say. I believe that it should not be on persons of color to help write those statements. There should be someone for whom that's their role. Now, if because I was a chief diversity officer and I'm Black and I'm experienced and I have expertise, yeah, that would be appropriate. But in terms of, for example, just what I'm hearing is people calling up Black folks who they probably didn't even know before and putting that burden on them in terms of what should I say, et cetera. And for me, that also smacks of a kind of falseness. It's like, what are you thinking? What do you want to say? I don't want to put words in your mouth to try to make you look good. But I have lots of other thoughts about that. I want to defer to my colleague to see if there's some advice. So to me, the basic answer is no. However, there could be conditions in which that would be appropriate, but it goes back to a point that Dr. Hotchkins made, which is so often we as people of color, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, are asked to do so much more work above and beyond our actual job description. And that insult is compounded by the fact that we often are not respected for the very work that we are hired to do.
Right, and so I'm mindful that the purpose of education is to stratify citizenry, right? And so I'm mindful that higher education is an institution, right? And so when the institution speaks publicly, I believe that the institution is moved to do so either to gain something or for fear of losing something. And so I read a lot. So I'm a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, right? And so last semester, the University of Oklahoma had 2 white professors use the N-word. They had 2 instances of white students roaming around campus in blackface, right? And the response that they wrote after George Floyd's death was greater than any of those responses that they should have written prior to that, right? When something actually happened on their campus. And so performative solidarity,
right?
I despise it,
right?
And so you have to mean it.
That's right.
When you do it. Now, as it relates to who's responsible for writing those, so I am an employee of Texas Tech, but I am not an agent of the institution.
Amen.
Right? I never will be. Yeah. And so there are some DEI officers at R1 institutions that have been hired to issue the All Lives Matter response, right? As it relates to policies, programming, and practices. Right. So I can read some of the responses and say, oh, okay, this president was advised by a DEI officer that has the All Lives Matter on set, right? This person is preserving their position on campus. versus
Yeah.
some responses. So the University of Utah has an amazing president, right? And all of, I know this person personally, right? But all of the responses are from the heart first, right?
Yeah.
So that president, she's leading saying, I'm a person, these things offend me, and this is my response as a person, but I represent the university, versus a response of, we're the university and we don't want to get sued by what we say.
Exactly.
So it is this moment is the moment of action.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm beyond, I stand in solidarity with you. I'm beyond racism is bad. I want to see you doing something, moving policy, practice, and programs where I can say, okay, Black Lives Matter, and I can see it in the policy, practices, and program, and I can hear it in what you say, and I can see it in your actions personally.
In your actions, exactly. Amen.
Thank you. I know we're past the hour. I want to thank you both for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here to provide this very important presentation. We definitely learned a lot, and we will continue to strive to forward and make the commitment. As we continue, I also want to thank the audience for joining us today, and to let you know that a link to an evaluation of this presentation will be sent to you shortly. Please remember to take a few minutes to complete it, and just want to let you all know that this concludes our presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.